What's up, my gregarious guardsmen? It's Chris with Tabletops and Tentacles, and this is Die Alone, a solo RPG and game podcast. On this episode of Die Alone, we're going to be talking about my first impressions of the Isofarian Guard, a big box, open world, video game inspired RPG type board game from Sky Kingdom Games. So before we dive into Isofarian Guard this week, we have a little State of the Dungeon updating. I'm not really backing much on Kickstarter right now, partially just because I'm broke, and so I've kind of just stayed away from examining it too closely. But Uncharted Stars is live right now, and I'm really excited about this. It's from Scott Alms and Tristan Rawson, who does a lot of board game artwork that I genuinely love. Have a little like roll and write Star Trek inspired game out right now. It's $5, $7, something like that to pledge, and you get a whole pile of different maps and star maps, and it's one of those where you can print out your ship and officer sheets, and then you can have as many people play as you want, or you can play it completely solo. And it's one of those games that I think I really like that type of game, but at the same time I've never technically played one of them, so I need to get my butt in gear and print out like Voyages or this or something like that and see if I actually like roll and write. I don't really know if I do, but it looks really great. I'm kind of, in some ways I'm kind of bummed that they only offer the digital copy of it, because what I love about Rawson's art so much is his use of color and like dynamism in their art style, and I'm more than likely going to be printing this out in black and white with the lowest color usage humanly possible. So it's kind of one of those where I kind of wish they'd offered like even just a print-on-demand color version that I could cut up, or something like Squid Ink is doing with their game books. But it looks really cool. It's called Uncharted Stars, and it's got over 20 days left on Kickstarter. They're running a kind of a cool, interesting concept with their campaign, because it's $7 to pledge, and they're running it long enough that people can kind of stumble across and find it, because it is kind of one of those games that's not really a high enough profit or cost margin to promote heavily, but it's still reasonable enough that somebody could stumble across it weeks later and be like, oh, I'll pledge that, $5. But it's pretty cool looking. I'm kind of into it. Beyond that, I am not really backing anything else. I was backing Korg Slayer, but it ended a few minutes ago. I do have a Kickstarter myself that's live right now. It's a book version from Squid Ink Games of my first card game I designed, Creature Features, and it's not a solo game, so I'm not going to harp on it too heavily here, but if you'd like to support us, it is live right now, and it is a print-on-demand version of the game where you can get the book printed and cut it up to use it. You could do you could just do a print and play if you'd prefer, or we're actually offering some of the original print run of the game, and it's just a fun, quick filler game where you're building monsters out of body parts, and it's kind of got a little bit of a take that aspect where if you play a certain body part, you get to steal a body part from your opposing mad scientist, and it's something I'm really proud of, but I was stubbornly persistent in having it put out in a VHS case, and it involved me hand stuffing every single one and putting the sleeve in and ordering all of the parts separately, and it just ended up being a lot of work for a Kickstarter campaign that didn't do real well. So I have a lot of the cards left that we just never ended up making into the full games, and so we decided to do a little Kickstarter like this where you can get the cards for $10 and play the game with professionally printed cards but get them hella cheap, or you can Even back there, I think there's a few copies left of the deluxe edition that comes in the VHS case that we did. But it's a game I'm really proud of, and I wanted another way to get it out there, and so I thought giving it a try with one of the Squid Ink print and play style books would be kind of fun to give it a go. It's still got, I think, 7 days or so go check it out over on Kickstarter. I'll throw some links below if you'd like to check it out, and take a look at Creature Features, my first card game I did. So other than that, I think we'll just dive directly into the game this week. This is Isofarian Guard from Sky Kingdom Games. Welcome to Isofar, a wild land severe in its beauty. The Isofarian people take great pride in their ability to flourish amongst the hostile wildlife and cruel elements of their mountainous home. As a member of the Isofarian Guard, life is never dull. You try to keep the peace among your fellow Isofarians, a never-ending job, as well as deal with constant threats from the aggressive Falmond Empire to the south. But now, the old patterns are shifting. New forces are at work that will change the very underpinnings of reality. You will guide 8 different Isofarian guards through 5 interweaving campaigns as they deal with a power that threatens not only Isofar, but the entire world. In the Isofarian Guard, you travel through the cities and wildernesses of Isofar on a beautifully illustrated world map, fighting off enemies using a unique and highly customizable battle system, and use your wits to talk your way out of sticky situations. As you forge important alliances, opportunities will arise for you to craft stronger gear, gain new powers, and step into the destiny you were called to. So it was September 2019 when I came across a game that looked a little overly epic. 1 to 2 player narrative-driven board game featuring a fully voice-acted storyline and musical score powered by Foreteller. I was unfamiliar with Sky Kingdom Games. I knew they'd done something called the Stonebound Saga previously, but hadn't played it or anything. And this game looked ambitious, to say the least. It was like $79, which back in the day was a lot, but still reasonable for a big box game. It was supposed to come out in 2020. It came out just a few weeks ago, so it has a little bit of a gestation period. So this game was originally supposed to have come out in December 2020, and I have to give absolute props to Sky Kingdom for having a project that never felt like it was threatened. I've backed a lot of games and projects that are further and further behind, and they feel a little more in doubt as the months go by, whereas Isofarian Guard never really felt like that. It definitely had, like, their updates were regular, their updates were upbeat and reasonable, and they were transparent about what they were working on and what changes were happening to this game. And if you go back and look at their original board game Kickstarter page versus what we got in the mail, which was a mini fridge in a box, basically, they killed themselves on this game. It's massive. It went from like 30 hours of campaign to well over 100 hours. There's tons of little side quests, and the quality of their components are top notch. And I am very, very impressed with this end product, despite it being over 3 years late, almost 3 years late. This game is a beast, and it's a beast in a handful of ways. So Isofarian Guard is sort of it's a very video game inspired RPG type open world game, which is a lot of stuff thrown at it, considering it's also a bag builder and a combat game and an exploration game. Before we dive into this game has 5 campaigns, and each of them are pretty significant, and in each one you play two completely different guards as you're proceeding through their campaign and their story. Then you move on to the next guard, to my knowledge. There will be spoilers in this discussion for the first campaign, but just the first part of the first campaign, because that's all I've played so far. So everything I'm talking about here will be in reference to just probably not even the first half of the first campaign. There's a lot of game here, and it could be quite a while before I'm far enough in to really talk about the game as a whole. But I kind of wanted to get my first impressions out there because it is available on their web store right now, but I think it's a fairly limited quantity, and I don't know how available this game will be after this until their second printing, which I don't love doing reviews of. A lot of the times I really prefer doing something that's fully available to people and readily accessible, but this is what I've been doing with some of my time, and I'm excited about it. So I thought, I have a podcast. I should talk about this game I've spent hours playing. So Isofarian Guards is a little unique in that it is really designed as much for solo play as anything. I have played a few rounds of a number of games, actually, with my wife as the second player, and one nice thing about this is that as long as they're not super concerned about all of the lore and the story that you're unlocking, it is really easy for someone to drop in and play that second character in the game. However, at least for the first two characters you play, Grigory and Alec, it doesn't really seem as fulfilling to have both of you playing, if that makes any sense. You play two very different characters as you're wandering across Isofar in this. Grigory is a beast of a man. He's got a very Viking look to him. He's the captain of the guard. He's got all sorts of abilities that let him just do damage left and right. Whereas Alec is a little younger. He sounds like a little kid in the foreteller narration, actually. But he's very much more a support character. So as you're playing the game with two players, the play experience, particularly during battles, is quite variable depending on who you're playing. But I'll get to that. That's getting a little ahead of myself. So in the game, you play a group of guards in a land called Isofar that is essentially Skyrim, if you've played the video game Skyrim. It has a very Elder Scrolls vibe. There's definitely some inspiration from it, as well as a handful of other of that type of game. And I'm not saying that as a criticism at all. I think that there's something very cozy about stepping into this particular type of fantasy world that you're familiar with, but it's still variable enough that you're not 100% familiar with it, if that makes sense. Really like that as we were playing this, especially with my wife, who's a Skyrim fanatic, there were aspects where she's like, we have to go mining. It's very important for us to get ore, because she's the type that alchemy is life when it comes to playing Skyrim. It's nice that it's variable enough to cover that. But anyway, in the game, you play Alec and Grigory in the first round here. And Grigory is the captain of the Isofarian Guard, who are sort of an isolated group of guards that are in charge of kind of keeping the peace against a neighboring kingdom. You're involved with a lot of little skirmishes and interruptions and things in your day-to-day business. It opens just in situ right away. It drops you right into the end of a battle. You're recovering from a little clash and a skirmish, and your group of guardsmen stumble across magic, basically. There are stones that impart certain abilities, and they're sort of one of those things that Jedi's, I don't think they exist, kind of thing, where there's all sorts of rumors and legends about it, but they're not necessarily known well. But all of your guardsmen end up sort of stone-bound to these magic stones, and they give you interesting abilities, but they also trigger a chain of events that results in you and your fellow guardsmen sort of being cast out and exiled from your job and your life that you've known previously. And so you're sort of adrift in Isofar at the beginning of this game. But you're adrift with a purpose. Obviously, as Isofarian Guards, you still have a duty to your kingdom and your country and the place you live to do something about this possible threat, but also possible power that could help protect your kingdom and make it better. And that's basically the story as you walk into this. It's kind of funny because there's not like there's a looming, dramatic, world-destroying thing that you immediately have to conquer. It's more, hey, we found these magic stones, but nobody believes they exist, so they kicked us out of the city kind of thing. And so it has that, like, on the outs, but you've got a little bit of a support system with your fellow guards, and it adds that little bit of survival to it, which I really appreciate. I haven't done the podcast episode on Sword and Sorcery yet, but that was one of the things that bothered me about that game, spoiler, in that you play like a couple of like reincarnated hero ghost spirit warriors that just kind of fight goblins in an alley. And in this, you feel a lot more street level, which I really like. I am not a huge fan of the whole epic level god killer games where you then don't feel like you're doing anything epic. And this strikes a pretty solid balance to it. I definitely get the impression that as the story goes on, I'm going to be becoming more powerful and becoming a larger part of a larger story. But for the moment, at least, the first chapter / quest book, I'm very much like couple of dudes who just got kicked out of their apartment and are trying to find someone's couch to crash on. So you're traveling across this overland map that it's really nice. It's big, it's colorful, the color scheme and vibe of it is great. It's got kind of some icy lands, it's got some interesting locations that you totally you see on the map and you're like, ooh, I want to go check that out. The map's a little bigger than it needs to be, but it's very dramatic and cool looking on the table, and I just have the regular version, not the larger neoprene one that they did. I really like having the map set out on the table, if only just because it's so thematic. There is a smaller version inside the book that you can use instead if you'd prefer, but it's a little too small, whereas this map's a little too big. There are some scale issues with this game that I'll discuss later that the map definitely has a part in. But anyway, as you're traveling across it, there are these little nodes of different color and different description and function that you can travel to. And basically, you are free to go wherever you would like in the land of Isofar, which is really... I mean, you have goals, you have locations that you're headed towards. You don't have to go there if you don't want to. And I love that aspect of that. In more than anything, this game absolutely captures that open world exploration vibe in a way that I didn't think they were going to be able to pull off. And I'm really impressed with it so far. The nodes themselves look a little CG and pasted on. I would have liked to have seen them integrated into the map artwork a little better than they are. Both look pasted on, but also hard to notice sometimes, which is kind of strange. But as you're traveling, you go in between different locations and you have a sack that is your exploration sack. And it has a number of chips inside it. This is a game that is very, very in love with their chips. The chips are all poker sized, they're weighted, they have like that little metal core inside them. They've got a nice texture and consistency, and they sound very satisfying when they clink together. The tactile aspect of the chips themselves is delightful. I love it. So anyway, you have 3 different bags of these chips. And during travel, you use the exploration bag. And inside that bag is typically 4 or 5 chips. It's not very well stocked, big picture. It does change as you play, and you can modify it and build it to a certain extent. As best I can see, the exploration bag doesn't get a lot of fiddling during the game. And inside are a number of chips that trigger battles. There are chips that trigger kind of exploration event markings, and then there's a few things that you can throw in to affect your travel. If you pull a battle out, which is a hefty part of this game. Luckily, I think that the battle system so far is pretty fun. You see what node you're on, you open up an index book, you find the node, and then you see what type of battle you've pulled, because there's 1, 2, 3 skull options on there, and it increases in difficulty or danger depending on where you are and what you draw. So like if you pull a single skull, you may end up facing a single guard or bandit or something like that. Whereas if you pull out a 3 skull, you might face a massive clay horn, which is like a Yeti rhino type thing, which I kind of dig it. But anyway, you pick your creature and your confrontation, and they go into the other half of the table that isn't connected to the map at all, and that is a set of double layer, really nice cardboard mats. And you've got 4 of them for enemies, and depending on how many enemies you end up facing off against, you layer each of them into their little spots, and then on their cards that you pull out of the index, they have stats printed very clearly, easy to read, how much damage they do, what their shields are, how much life and how much action points they start with. And you slap that in, you take a couple of cubes and slot them in where they go, and then every enemy you face has their own action deck. And this is a really fun little system. I kind of like that there are different levels of enemies, but they use the same action decks. They just have different levels of effectiveness depending on whether you're fighting a 2-star bandit or a 4-star bandit. It's kind of cool because as you play it and face them more times, you become more accustomed to what they can and can't do. But anyway, you set out them, and there's an interesting mechanic with that where they tell you what order you're facing them, and they go into the 1st and 2nd slot, and then the 3rd and 4th slot are behind that, and you can't attack those ones directly until you defeated the 1st and 2nd slot of enemies. So if there's an archer hanging out in that 3rd slot, he can just keep picking at you with his bow while you're trying to fight off the 2 bandits that are in melee in front of you. And so it's a little thing, it's just a tiny touch, but it's got just a little bit of an element of like a tactical placement that actually does change the flow of battle more than I expected it to. It's kind of neat. Gregory has one of his stone-bound abilities, which is kind of like a special attack, lets him attack everyone, and so that it becomes really valuable when you've got a character that's behind 2 other enemies you're fighting, and the only way you can attack them is by using his stone-bound ability. Then you've got your characters themselves, which both consist of 2 double-layer boards, one of which tracks your life, your attack skills, your guarded, like your level of armor, as well as what you've got with you. You have a number of slots that you can slot like things you found, loot, and building equipment and supplies into, as well as your weaponry and armor that you're wearing. Each of the weapons and armor have potential to embed stones into them to make them more powerful, which gives you more attack ability or attack power or more chips in your particular bag. So there's definitely a bag building aspect to this game, and almost everything on that board dictates how many chips and what chips you have in your bag. On the other board, it is kind of your ability board, your skills board. And there's a number of slots, I think it's 6, and each of them have a spot where you can put one of your skills into. And they come in two different classes. There are the ones that are directly connected to these stones that you've discovered. And these are sort of the magical special ability stones. Like Gregory's lets you activate it to damage everyone on the board. And then you can't use that ability. It rotates down into sort of a neutral slot until your next turn. So it rotates through, giving you an imposed limitation on how often you can use your special abilities. Then in addition to that, each character has their own unique different skills that they can use. Gregory's is primarily battle related. There's different stances he can take. There's different types of attacks he can use, whereas Alex are far more potion based and support related. And it's really interesting as you play the two of them how different they really are. Like most of Gregory's stuff, once you use it, you flip it, and there's a different skill on the other side. Whereas Alex, the only way you can flip his potions to the other side is to use a special ability that allows it. And that changes up the gameplay significantly with both of these characters from turn to turn, because you have to think about whether the attack you're making on this particular turn is beneficial. So it's really interesting because these flipping of the cards with Gregory, they result in very different options that at times makes you not want to activate a card because you don't want it to flip at the end of the turn because you want to be able to use it on the next one. There's a really nice amount of strategy and cooperation between the two characters, deciding, okay, if I go first and I can get you an extra action cube, then you can activate your skills quicker, but you need to make sure you activate the one that lets you chain this card. It's pretty surprisingly complex, but at the same time, every aspect of it is structured. You do this, then this, then this, then you do this. And as long as you continue to play with that in mind, it stays really straightforward. My wife has some brain damage and some vision issues ever since a medical event a few years ago, and she hasn't really played very many board games with me since. But this game was just Skyrim heavy enough that she was like, oh, I want to give this a go. And the story was interesting enough to her that she played a number of rounds with me, and she was able to take this character who has a fairly complex battle system and enjoy playing it. And I didn't expect that, because honestly, looking at these boards that you have laid out in front of you with chips and cards and coins and tokens and cubes, and then enemies with the same, it looks really overwhelming. But as long as you focus on what your character is doing in the steps as it's laid out, the battle system's actually surprisingly complex, but understandable right off the bat. It's kind of neat. They have... So to activate your cards and skills that you have to use chips from your bag. And you pull chips from your bag based off of how many action cubes you have. Your action points dictate how many of the black chips you pull out. And there's swords and shields, very simple. You can use a single shield on a single shield cost item, or you can use two swords as a shield, or vice versa. So there's always a little bit of flexibility there depending on what you pull out of your bag. You also tweak and adjust your bag based off of different skills and negative effects that all generate different chips that you put inside your bag. There are chips that add attack power to all of the attacks you do for that round. There are chips that are detrimental to your shield ability. There are some of them in there that are just awful. Like the poison's not great, but there's some of them in there that prevent you from using your stonebound abilities or prevent you from using your guard abilities that are just absolutely brutal when you have a certain number of chips in your bag and the first one you pull out is one that prevents you from using half of them. It's a pretty cool system though, because The black chips in your bag stay there except for when you draw them. And then once you've drawn all of them out of the bag, you can reset your bag at the end of a battle, or you can pay a life to put chips back in so that you know you're getting something good out. There are red chips in the bag that are detrimental to you. There are green chips you can put in the bag that are positive effects, but only last for that round that you pull them out. And then there are purple chips, which are added based off of boosting your abilities or leveling up or increasing your skills or changing a weapon you're using or something like that. So there's a pretty wide variety of stuff that you can be pulling out of this bag at any given time. And it's kind of cool because you're pulling black chips up to the amount of action points you have. So if you have 2 action points and you pull 2 black chips out right off the bat, that's all you get to work with for that turn. But if you got a whole pile of green and purple chips in there, and you pull those out before you hit that second black chip, you get to use all of those for your turn. So it becomes this kind of interesting balancing act where you definitely want to know what's in your bag, or at least keep track of what you've built so that you know what you have to work with on any given turn. There's definitely some benefits to kind of pacing yourself and not pulling too many cubes out, because there's a certain point where you can't use some of them to activate anything and they're wasted. And it's way more streamlined than I expected it to be. I thought that this was going to be just a absolute chore to pull these chips out and know what to do with them, but everything is really straightforward. All the iconography on the cards, with the exception of the art for the chips themselves, and I'll get to that in a second, all the iconography is very clear. You know you need 1 sword to activate this card. You know you need 1 sword or 1 shield to use this card. And you put the chip down on that and you use that ability. And then they each have some interesting abilities that are secondary on each of the cards, and those are activated differently depending on the character you're playing. Gregory has a chain ability that lets you activate the second skill on any card past the first one you use, which can let him build up some really cool, impressive attacks where he will build up his attack skill and then make extra attacks with that extra attack skill added to them, and then boost his shields right before the enemy gets to attack, kind of thing. And it's pretty impressive when you can get it going right, and it's heartbreaking when you have the perfect thing figured out against the perfect enemy, and then you only pull 1 of the chips you need out of your bag. It's really tense in a way that I didn't expect it to be. Alex, a little more of a support character. He, at the beginning, isn't real battle focused. In fact, you run out of chips quite often with him because he doesn't load it with swords and stuff the way Gregory does. But his skills are all potions that are supplementary or kind of sneaky once you get used to how to use them. And one of his abilities that you unlock using the experience point system, which they call SIL, lets you use the additional powers on the potions, or it lets you flip different ones depending on what you're doing with them. He's a little harder to figure out. He's less straightforward, but once you do figure him out, he's actually pretty fun to play with because he has a lot of interesting strategic options that Gregory's basically just, oh, I'm gonna screw these guys up, whereas Alex more like, I'm gonna poison them and give you extra moves, and then I'm gonna... It's interesting how different they are, and more than anything, playing the 2 characters the way it is, because those are the 2 you are required to play with for the first chapter, it really makes me curious to see how different the other characters are in the other chapters, because the guards all look pretty radically different, and I'm kind of stoked to find out what they play like. And that's not normal for me. I'm not I want to strategize my card battles. That's just not how I play usually. So combat has been a lot more fun in this than I expected it to be. The creatures are pretty varied. The creatures and people you're battling are pretty varied. The artwork on them is really nice, and their activation and reaction cards have some really cool touches to them. Like, some of them will trigger healing on one of their other enemies, or they will attack you, then heal themselves, then draw another card that will only be functional if they have enough action cubes to actually use. Those aspects of their deck are surprisingly varied depending on the different types of characters you're playing and fighting against as well. I really dig this game, guys. Like, it's way more fun than I thought it was going to be. And I'm happy that it is, because it comes in a box large enough to fit a small child in. So some of these games, like, let's say Gloomhaven. I know Gloomhaven is a great game. I've yet to play it because it's one of those things where I pull it out and I become immediately overwhelmed with stuff. And I don't know why it's so intimidating to me and overwhelming. It shouldn't be, and it's probably not as bad as it seems. I have Jaws of the Lion, and I've played that, and I love it. But for some reason, there's something about Isofarian Guards, despite the fact that when you open the box, there's like 9 other boxes, and each of those has a dozen different things in it. Once you get it out on the table, everything has a cohesive flow to it. And that flow makes the game immediately comprehensible in a way I didn't expect. Aside from combat, there are travel events that can happen, and I'm not a huge fan of the way they do it. There's separate decks of cards depending on which nodes you're on, and when you pull out the compass chip, you put a cube on that deck of cards, and once there are 3 cubes, you get to pull one of the cards and read it, and it's usually some sort of beneficial or interesting story event that occurs. And I love the cards. I think they're great. So far, all of them that I've encountered have been fun, interesting events, but they don't happen often enough. 90% of the time, you're either putting a cube on a card and not getting to do anything else, or you're battling something. And one nice thing about the compass is it can allow you to choose a battle for that node as well if you want to. You don't have to fight, but you can. And that's a neat way, because all of the enemies on the backside of their cards have drops. And they will drop experience, which are called Lux, I think. I don't remember. One is Lux and one is Sil, one is coin and one is experience. They both are on a little twisty thing, and they're not my favorite part of the game. Anyway, they drop those, but they also often drop loot in the form of metal fragments or crafting pieces or things that you can use at a town to build up your weapons and abilities. This game has a lot going on, guys. Like, I know I'm talking a lot about this game, and I haven't even gotten to, the story yet. But anyway, so once you pull a compass out, you can decide if you want to do a battle, and you put a cube over on it. The cards themselves are really fun. I love the events and the things that happen on the cards, but they don't happen often enough. And more fiddly is that they're not clear about where you are on the map. Like Dungeon Generates, I have issues with knowing what region of the map I'm on because the colors are all totally batshit crazy. Here, you have to look up in a book and say, okay, node 63 is in the red deck, and so I'll put a cube on that one because that's what node I'm on. And it's just fiddly enough that if they had done even the barest tweak to that so that you didn't have to open a separate book to see what region you were in, it would have made a big difference in the streamlining of that particular step. It's fun. I wish that there was a little more to it, because 80% of travel is combat, and the world and the explorations in the world are so interesting and varied that I would have liked to have seen more of that happening. That's one of the things I love about Dungeon Degenerates is, yes, you're fighting a lot, but you're also pulling interesting, unique, fun story cards, even if they don't really do anything. There's just a little bit more story with it that I feel like I'm missing a little bit of in this game. Luckily, combat's fun, and so it makes up for it to an extent. And there are a lot of events and actual locations around the board as well that help alleviate some of that fatigue. There's towns all over the place. There are nodes where you can fish or mine or harvest wood. And you need to do those things because not only are those useful for food and healing and upgrading weapons and armor, or building entirely new weapons and armor at the blacksmith in town, but you have a little fort that you and your guards are building up that has this cool little base building aspect to it. It's a separate map, and it has the little cards that pull off like that Robin Hood game. And as you're building different pieces of your fort, you put them in and slot them in where you're like, oh, I finished the dock. I get to put the dock in. And it's kind of cool. It's got this neat aspect where you're building up sort of your home base. You can choose which ones you're focusing on, and it helps, like you could store stuff there and that kind of thing, which becomes a little more of an issue as you're playing along and you're starting to carry like bear pelts and metal and all sorts of extra stuff with you. You get to explore the board, you get to follow the story, but you don't have to follow the story. And in fact, I recommend a little bit of grinding at times because there's definitely some aspects of it that turn into you can definitely get in over your head quickly if you progress too fast in the story. One little hint without feeling spoilery, like you can upgrade your armor and weapons from a 1-star to a 2-star and so forth. And I would highly suggest having armor and weapons that are comparable to the chapter number that you're in thus far. Chapter 1 or 1-star weapon with Alec is not going to cut it in Chapter 2 very well. But it's neat that it doesn't force you to do that kind of thing too. You can pick, you can choose, you can decide what type of weapons you use, and it really does have an open world vibe in that respect. I've enjoyed it so far. I've barely scratched the surface of this game, and I know that there's a lot more to get into, but I'm looking forward to it. So let's talk negatives of this game, because there are negatives to this. As much as I love the exploration and the story's great too, there is a lot of reading, but if you want to spend another $16, you can get the Foreteller app, which was included in the Kickstarter, depending on the pledge level you picked. I would recommend it. Normally, I'm not a big fan of that because I like reading, but particularly if you ever plan on playing this with someone else too, the Foreteller app eliminates some of that story time that stuff like Dragonholt has, where you're just sitting and reading pages of story to somebody else while they sit in front of you with their little miniature. The Foreteller app's fully acted, it's got sound effects, it's got music, and it's really well done. I feel like it is one of those times where I really do think it's beneficial and it adds to the enjoyment of the game, which is not normally something I'm real big into. Like ISS Vanguard, I read most of them instead of listening to the app because it changes the flow of the game in a way that I didn't appreciate. But the way that the interstitials here are added in, the Foreteller app becomes almost an essential part of the story and the flow of the game. I feel like the game is too big in a couple of ways. I think the game itself is great. To play the game, you have 4 wire-bound books or flyers or leaflets out on the table at any given time, because you have the storybook, you have the rule book, you have the quick reference book, you have the index that tells you all of the enemies and which zone you're in, you have a little mini map for different towns that you go to, which is a cool thing, but it feels really underutilized because you can move around for free. There's nothing event-wise, and so really the existence of the mini map that you pull out, you put your mini on, move around, feels completely superfluous to the actual play. The map in particular and the functionality of it is probably my biggest gripe. The minis that this game comes with are beautiful. They're big, they're chunky, they've got amazing detail, especially if you take the time to paint them. They turn out looking great. It's the two guards together back to back in a combat mode, and each one has that set of minis, but they're gigantic. Like, there are spots on the map where you're supposedly moving your mini around where you cover like 3 nodes in some extent, and you have to move them to see where you're even at each time. They're way bigger than they need to be. I've actually ended up swapping out all of my like functional map movements for a little 15mm Old Glory Viking miniature that fits perfectly on the little nodes, and you can actually see where they are on the board without having to lift them up to see which node they're on. Likewise, there's a campfire poker chip that you move around that you can kind of respawn at, and it's way bigger than it needs to be. Like, this poker chip's very satisfying and fun to put into your bag or pull back out or clank around on the table, but it's not as useful on a map when it's 4 to 6 times bigger than it needs to be. It's really kind of inexplicable to me. I also think it's really strange that they rely so heavily on these really nice chips for a lot of aspects. You track your map, you track your aggro, you track your movement, you track your exploration with these tokens, and yet the two things that in a normal game would have had tokens or chips or coins, your experience and your gold, they have these fiddly little dials that are, first of all, they're really loose, so if you pick it up too sloppily with these big clumsy hands like I do, you'll have to lose your count. And second of all, it feels so inexplicably out of character for the rest of the game when so much of the game is about tactile weight and vibe to it, that the fact that the gold coins you collect from the enemies aren't actual gold coins is baffling to me. I've basically just thrown the dials in a box and I'm using like cool gems and coins to track my experience points and coins because the dials are awful. Another couple of fiddly complaints I have that I forgot when I initially recorded this, so this is me popping back in. Hi, I'm Chris. Is that I mentioned the imagery of the chips on the cards. They're really hard to see. Once you get playing the game, they're not as big a deal, but initially you can't tell if it's supposed to be a red chip or a green chip or a purple chip or a black chip you're putting into your bag. And once you get used to it, you realize that it's always either going to be a red or a green, because blacks and purples only go in when you upgrade or change your character. But they're really hard to see on the cards. Most of the rest of the iconography is pretty easy to read and understand, but the color of the chip that it's referencing, very impossible to see. Also, you track your life and like your health and everything using little cube that you move along the board in this nice little dual layered slot situation for both you and the enemies you're fighting. But the problem is that it only goes up to a certain amount, and especially with the enemies, once you start attacking and fighting things that have more than 10 life, you've got to like put one on a 10 and one over on a 1, and then you've got to keep track of which one is which, and you've got to move 2 different cubes around, and sometimes there's something that affects their life that means you're moving 3 cubes around because you've got one that indicates what it originally was, and it becomes a lot more work than it should have if they'd had just a slightly larger track. But it's little things. It's really not a big thing, but I thought I would mention them while we're griping about things. And by we, I mean me. Now, back to me. The side quests are cool. There's a whole pile of different ones that you could pick up in town, and they give you extra challenges and extra rewards. There's a few other little quibbles that are a little mildly obnoxious, but nothing that really affects the gameplay so much as like the cut and finish of things. Like there's sleeving your cards would be pretty essential with this, except there's like 1,000 cards, and I backed this back before I sleeved anything, so I didn't order the sleeves. Because there are quite a few of them, especially like Gregory's like action cards that you're flipping every single time you use them, that it would be nice to have those protected. So that's something I probably need to do. But the loot comes on little square cards, and like if you get a bear pelt and you already had one, you turn it over to the 2 side. And so there's like this smooth little built-in system there, but there is a little bit of card fiddling, digging through the index and stuff to find rewards and loot as you're playing, but nothing that really is anything more than just a little fiddly. Like overall, the fit and finish of this game is really nice. Aside from like the map scale and the lack of coins, I don't have a lot to complain about from a graphic end of things. Like the boxes are all clearly labeled, so when you open the big old box, you can see which ones have the maps and which ones have the player boards. I'm not a big fan of game trays generally. About half the time it feels like they make things clunkier than they need to, but the game trees in this are really slick. Like the player boards have a tray that you can put all of them into without moving your cubes, and then it seals shut and saves your place for each of your characters. There's game tray tubs for each of the different colored cubes you use, and all of those are really well done. There is extra space in the box, like there's a whole extra box in the box that is basically there for people that sleeve, and if you don't sleeve your cards, it's totally superfluous. I'd find the minis to be totally superfluous as well. I wish it had been like an ISS Vanguard situation where they'd been a separate purchase that I didn't need to get. But my only real complaint about that is that this game is so big it doesn't fit in a Calyx because of all of this extra stuff. It's a big game. It's kind of crazy. To my knowledge, I believe it is going to be $160 once it goes to retail or with the reprint or whatever it was. So as a backer 4 years ago, I feel like I got a heck of a steal for the $79 or whatever it was. But I still think it's worth picking up. For the price, you get a fantastic amount of content. It's kind of nice because it's got a very like legacy building aspect to it, but at the same time there's nothing specifically destructive, so if you finish the game, there's nothing saying you can't give it to somebody else. There are a few things in the books that you track that, like, you can upgrade your character and there's an upgrade tree, and you can mark those in the book if you'd like, but you can also print out that tree from their website and track it that way instead, which frankly, that's what we do just because it's just another book to have open on the table, and I'd rather have a separate piece of paper underneath my character sheet that I can just pull out and upgrade. Overall, so far, my first impressions in this hour-long rant about this game is that Isofarian Guard's pretty well held up to its end of things. It's one of those Kickstarters where I had kind of forgotten about it, and then it showed up, and I was sure I wasn't even going to pull it out and play it for months. And it had just enough intrigue that as I was pulling it out and, undoing all the cards and looking at the pieces and oohing and awing, which is what I do with half my games before I ever play them, I was like, you know what? I want to pull this out and actually give it a go. And I'm really glad I did. I think it's one of those that I will probably just leave out on the table, and it's pretty easy to save. It's pretty easy to stop once you've finished an exploration node, and so you can just pick it up and play it for a little while and then go back to it again later, and you're not so deep into the middle of something that you forget where you are or feel like you've got to relearn the game, because it's streamlined enough that you really can kind of use it as this is bad terminology perhaps, but a tabletopper game. I'm lucky enough here in our new place that the old bar that I live in has become kind of the game and project room, and I have one table where I can keep a game up all the time, and this has become my tabletop game right now, where I can just go over it and play it for an hour or two when I feel like it, and then just leave it, walk away, and come back to it. And this is the perfect game to sit out and gather dust, is not the blurb they're looking for, but it sort of works for me like that. Like, I have a lot of games that, even some of the smaller solo RPG stuff, where pulling it out and reacquainting yourself with where you are with it becomes a little bit of a daunting prospect. And that is where, to me, so far, Isofarian Guard really shines. You don't have a tremendous amount of reacquainting in terms of how the game plays if you want to pick it up and play it again later. Lift with your knees if you're picking it up to play with it, however, because it's a heavy beast. I think it was like 40 pounds. It's nuts. But yeah, that was my first impression of Isofarian Guard. I apologize for going a little long on this. So that was my first impressions of Isofarian Guard. I hope you guys enjoyed this type of podcast as well. I know I talked a little more about mechanics than I usually do, but for board games like this, especially first impressions, it's kind of harder to do the overall story vibe that I can usually talk about with the other games, because I'm not far enough into it. But also, I feel like before you pick up a game like this, knowing that part of it is almost more important. So I hope you enjoy this type of thing. I'll probably do it occasionally, just because some of these games are going to take me months to actually play enough to do a full episode on, but I still want to talk about them, and they're games I'm playing and I'm excited about. So I thought I would try this and see what you guys think. I hope you enjoyed a first impression type podcast as well. I really enjoy Isofarian Guard. I am impressed at a lot of the things they've done with it. If you backed it and you just have this massive box lurking in the corner, pull it out and give it a go. I think it plays really nice as solo in particular, because the puzzliness of combat and your two characters you're controlling, they really play off of themselves in a way that's really quite fun solo, but also prompts interesting conversations if you're playing with someone else. So yeah, I believe Isofarian Guards is available on their website right now in a fairly limited quantity. Last time I looked, there were less than 200 copies available, but I will put a link to it below. It is my understanding that they are planning a reprint campaign soon-ish, now that it's fulfilled and people are getting it. And if that does happen, I'll be sure to mention it on a future episode. Speaking of future episodes, I have a couple of games that are in progress right now that'll be coming out soon. I just finished a number of games playing Dragonbane Solo, which is an RPG from Free League that is out in PDF, but not physical yet. That has a it's based off of an old school game that they've kind of rebooted and renovated, and I'm enjoying it so far. So that's going to be the next episode. I'll talk about my Dragonbane solo campaign. I'm also playing a RPG called Little Town that is a Twin Peaks inspired solo RPG that I'm really enjoying. I'll put a link to it in here as well, and that'll probably be the episode after Dragonbane. If you'd like to support the show, as always, our Patreon is not super active, but every penny of that allows me to do these podcasts and shows like this. and just keep on surviving. You can find links to my books on DriveThruRPG, and check out Creature Features on Kickstarter right now. Go get yourself a fun little monster building game. As always, thank you so much for supporting indie creators, and remember, we all die alone.